Yes, so we are live. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to announce a new discussion of our webinar from the journal Revista Estudos Hegelianos. Luis Fernando, if you want to say some words, Luis Fernando is the president of the Hegel Brazilian Society. I think you are mute.
Yeah, I said that I will speak in Portuguese. Yes, I'm briefly presentation. Boa tarde a todas e todos, e a gente está começando mais um webinário da Revista Estudos Hegelianos com a professora Karen Eng, e eu gostaria de dizer algumas coisas antes de começar a respeito da professora. A professora Karen Eng fez a sua graduação na Universidade de Toronto em 2005. Ela concluiu o seu trabalho de mestrado na Universidade de Essex em 2006. E ela fez doutorado na New School for Social Research, em Nova York, em 2013. Né? Também fez alguns estágios de pesquisa doutoral na Alemanha, principalmente em Frankfurt, em 2010, 2011. Né? Ela já foi Research Fellow no Centro de Humanidades e Mudança Social da Humboldt Universität, em 2018, e foi pesquisadora visitante no Centro de Humanidades Dahlem, da Universidade Livre de Berlim, em 2018. Bom, a professora Karen atualmente trabalha como professora na Universidade de Vanderbilt, University, em Nashville, desde 2021. E atualmente ela é bolsista da Fundação Alemã Alexander von Humboldt, na Universidade de Potsdam, no período de 2023 a 2025. Sobre a pesquisa da professora Karen Eng, a principal é justamente o livro dela, que a gente vai discutir aqui, né, que é Hegel's Concept of Life, Self-Consciousness, Freedom, Logic, publicado pela Oxford University Press em 2020, e no qual, a tradução do título, né, o conceito de vida de Hegel, autoconsciência, liberdade e lógica, né, publicado pela Oxford. E, em linhas gerais, o que ela pretende com esse livro é defender a centralidade do conceito de vida para a compreensão de aspectos chaves da filosofia do Hegel. Né? Mas, além disso, né, do tema que ela trabalha nesse livro, ela também está interessada, né, como interesse de pesquisa, na influência de Hegel e Marx na teoria crítica, né, e como eles contribuem para o entendimento da relação entre seres humanos e natureza, possibilidades e fracassos do reconhecimento mútuo, concepções de progresso e de crítica. Né. Atualmente, ela trabalha num livro que provavelmente vai se intitular Species Being, Ethical Life Between Humanity and Nature, né? A gente poderia traduzir aqui, a palavra acho que é alemã é Gattungswesen, né? Ser genérico, poderia também ser, literalmente seria ser específico, né? Mas ser genérico, vida ética entre humanidade e natureza. Tá? E também partindo de Hegel, do idealismo alemão, Marx e da teoria crítica, ela quer mostrar como esse conceito de ser genérico, né, Speziesbin, ou Gattungswesen, né? Que é o original em alemão que o Hegel usa. Ele fornece a armação para entender e avaliar aquilo que é a vida ética. Tá? Ela também está escrevendo um livro sobre Hegel e a escola de Frankfurt, desculpa. Ela também publicou vários artigos sobre Hegel, filosofia clássica alemã, teoria crítica, conceito de ideologia em Hegel e Marx. Tá? Basicamente, esses são os principais interesses de pesquisa da professora, né? E antes de passar a palavra para ela, eu também gostaria de agradecer imensamente quem fez todo o contato com ela e fez isso, e desenvolveu, fez com que fosse possível a realização desse webinário, que é a Renata Guerra, né? Que ela faz parte da editoria da Revista Estudos Hegelianos, mas que, infelizmente, ela não pôde estar aqui hoje. Tá? Eu também agradeço o trabalho dos outros editores adjuntos que colaboraram para isso, né? E que 2 estão aqui, o Emanuel Nakamura, o professor também Hernandes Eichenberger, né? E também a professora Patrícia Riffel e Poliana Tidri. Tá? Bom, então o que vai acontecer agora é que a professora Karen vai ter a palavra, ela vai falar, sei lá, mais ou menos uns 40 minutos, e depois da apresentação dela, a gente abre o debate para perguntas, tá? Basicamente é isso. Karen, du kannst sprechen, bitte.
Vielen Dank. Thank you so much. Thank you for that invitation. Thank you to Renata and Emmanuel and the Revista Estudos Hegelianos for this invitation to speak at this webinar. So I have a PowerPoint, and I will I will sort of try to speak very slow. I'll go slowly through the paper. So the talk is called Self-Consciousness, a Species Consciousness, and it's really, it's a work in progress. It's an attempt to think through a very famous passage from a very famous section of the Phenomenology of Spirit. So I'll just begin. So the topic of self-consciousness is in many ways the beating heart of debates in classical German philosophy, and for good reason. It marks the distinction between philosophical reflection that is critical and that which is dogmatic. It represents the key to various forms of idealism, from transcendental to absolute. It is the answer to the epistemological question of the conditions of possibility of knowledge and a novel approach to the possible relation between logic and metaphysics. Finally, it represents a distinctly modern conception of freedom as self-determination, one that unfolds historically and is expressed in the development of the species. All of this might seem like too much to ask of one concept, right? Can the concept of self-consciousness be the key to all of that? Maybe this is just an idiosyncratic use on the part of the idealists of a very familiar term, but attention to self-consciousness has undoubtedly yielded a wealth of philosophical insight, and interest in the topic shows no signs of abating. So today, my aim in this paper is to consider a fairly well-known but surprisingly under-theorized idea in Hegel's philosophy, namely that self-consciousness is species consciousness. Hegel's way of putting this idea most prominently in the Phenomenology of Spirit, but also found elsewhere, is that self-consciousness is the Gattung, or the genus, that is for itself. So before I go on, I just want to just a quick note about the translation of the term Gattung into English. I'm not sure how this is translated into Portuguese. In English, it's a bit awkward, so it would be best in some ways to leave the term untranslated. English translations of Hegel use the term genus, so Gattung is translated as genus. But of course, as we all know, as I heard in the introduction, in Marx, right, Marx's famous term Gattungswesen is translated into English as species being. So In Hegel, he distinguishes between genus and species with the terms Gattung and Art. But in many places, including, I think, in the passage that I'm going to be thinking about here today, it's clear that Gattung is more appropriately understood as species rather than genus. So for the remainder of the talk, when I use the term species consciousness, I'm referring to this idea of Hegel's that we are the Gattung that is for itself. So I think species consciousness is just the way that I'm going to refer to this term. So that's just a note about the translation of the term Gattung. So this idea that self-consciousness is the Gattung or the genus for itself, I think at first pass, this can actually seem like quite an odd claim. Since self-consciousness is generally taken to be about the I, whether this is understood as self-reference, as subjective self-awareness, apperception, or most generally, the activity or self-relation that is expressed in the ability of a subject to take itself as an object in some sense. The idea of a genus or species appears to lie at the opposite end of a spectrum of questions concerning the individual self-relation of the I, asking instead about generic or universal terms applicable to many individuals that share some features in common. So I'm not going to read this passage right now, but I just put this up here because this is the passage that basically is the inspiration. This is the passage that I'm going to be trying to figure out during this talk, and later on in the talk I will read it and say more about it. But I just wanted to put this passage up here for now, but I won't read it. In many of Hegel's formulations, however, self-consciousness or the I is identified with species consciousness, a claim that in the crucial transition in chapter 4 of the Phenomenology is at least as important as his more famous claim that self-consciousness is desire itself, or Begierde überhaupt. Self-consciousness as species consciousness, we can go to the next slide here, arises as a result of Hegel's presentation of the relation between desire and life, where awareness and self-awareness of life's shape, process, and universal unity bring about the self-relation of the pure I. So my goal in what follows is to try to shed some light on this intimate connection between self-consciousness and species consciousness proposed by Hegel, and to draw out some of the key consequences of this claim. So within the context of classical German philosophy, this connection between self-consciousness and species consciousness has been explored by two other thinkers that I just want to briefly mention here, but I won't talk about for the rest of the talk. The next slide, please. So the two thinkers are Fichte and Marx. So in his Foundations of Natural Right, Fichte presents an influential argument that being summoned to exercise one's free efficacy by another rational being is a necessary condition of self-consciousness. In outlining the relation of what he calls free reciprocal efficacy, freien Wechselwirksamkeit, between potentially and actually rational beings through which self-consciousness is realized, Fichte concludes that, quote, the concept of the human being is not the concept of an individual, for an individual human being is unthinkable, but rather the concept of a species, or Gattung. The concept of the species thus plays a central role in Fichte's deduction of the conditions of self-consciousness, where an individual self-conscious I is thinkable only in connection with the concept of a species. Drawing extensively on Hegel, Marx very famously in his early writings develops the connection between self-consciousness and species consciousness through this idea of species being, or Gattungswesen. For Marx, species being denotes what is distinctive of self-conscious human life in contrast to non-human animal life. Like his idealist predecessors, Marx contends that self-consciousness contains the key for understanding the conditions of knowledge and freedom, stressing that the powers of self-conscious life lie in the human ability to, quote, make his own species and the species of other things into his objects. The powers of knowing and agency that are associated with self-consciousness are attributed primarily for Marx to species consciousness, the power to relate to oneself as, quote, the present living species and as a universal and therefore free being. So as I said, understanding the details of Fichte's and Marx's accounts are obviously big, huge, independent tasks of their own, and I'm not going to take this up further today in this talk, but I do think that their formulations concerning this intrinsic and intimate connection between self-consciousness and species consciousness, so this idea that the self-conscious I is unthinkable without the concept of a species, and that self-consciousness makes its own species into its object. I think these formulations are really helpful, and can be important for thinking about how I'm going to interpret Hegel's account of the Gattung for itself in what follows. So next slide, please. This is just an outline of my talk today. Basically, as I said, so the rest of the talk is going to be sort of an extensive reflection on the opening paragraphs of chapter 4 of the phenomenology. The paper will have 3 sections. First, I'm going to talk about this relationship between knowing and desire that we get in the opening of chapter 4, and how some different ways scholars have tried to understand this. In the second section, I'm going to talk about this idea of the self-sufficiency of life and the idea of the simple genus, or the einfache Gattung, which I think is very important. Understanding this idea of the einfache Gattung is really important for understanding why Hegel says that self-consciousness is the Gattung for itself. And then I'll have a very brief conclusion at the end to try to draw out some of the consequences and problems or difficulties of Hegel's claim. So the first section, next slide, is knowing and desire. So Hegel's treatment of self-consciousness is distinctive in a number of ways. And I think it's important to situate his account in contrast to more familiar ways of treating this very familiar topic. So first, self-consciousness, next slide, is treated not primarily as a form of introspection or self-awareness, but is situated within the broader project of the phenomenology of understanding the nature of knowing, or das Wissen. For Hegel, all knowing, even the knowing of oneself that is characteristic of self-consciousness, stands in relation to an object that is outside of oneself. In the introduction, adapting Reinhold's principle of consciousness, Hegel defines knowing as the relation between consciousness and its object, placing an emphasis on what it means for an object to be for a consciousness. So the key puzzle for a philosophical investigation into the nature of knowing is to come to an understanding of this relation. Or, as Hegel writes in the next slide, this is a famous passage from the introduction, he says that consciousness distinguishes something from itself, while at the same time relates itself to it. Or, as it is expressed, this something is something for consciousness, and the determinate aspect of this relating, or the being of something for a consciousness, is knowing. Next slide, please. So knowing then concerns the nature of a relation, and the possibilities of different kinds of knowing depend in part on the kind of object to which one relates. Even though self-consciousness is a knowing of oneself, Hegel's account, maybe oddly, is oriented in large part by this more outward-directed question of self-consciousness's proper object and the relationship that this enables. So the nature of self-consciousness cannot be investigated simply by turning inward, whether by turning to the I think, or attending to first personal self-awareness. Rather, it is in the ambiguity of consciousness's relation to an object taken to be independent and in itself, and that same object taken as something for consciousness, that the self-relation characteristic of self-consciousness is made possible. So this is the first sort of peculiar thing about Hegel's account. The entire investigation of self-consciousness is much more about the object that self-consciousness is relating to, rather than sort of an inward, introspective investigation into something like the nature of self-awareness. Okay, so second, next slide, self-consciousness as a mode of knowing is understood not as an immediate fact or mental state of affairs, but as a fundamental type of activity. Following Fichte and rejecting some accounts, and rejecting the accounts of mind presented by both empirical and rational psychology, Hegel everywhere treats self-consciousness as a kind of self-constituting activity, that is characterized by drive, Trieb, and inner division, and Zweung, leading to his famous statement that self-consciousness is desire itself. In characterizing self-consciousness as activity, initially in terms of desire, Hegel brings together the idea that self-consciousness is a mode of purposive, self-constituting activity, with his claim that all knowing stands in relation to an object. Desire is driven towards and given shape by its object, and possibilities for the satisfaction of desire are determined in relation to possibilities afforded by the object. So Hegel's understanding of self-consciousness as purposive, desirous, living activity whose relation to self is given shape through its relation to objects have led some scholars to argue that there is simply a fundamental change of topic in the chapter 4 transition. In focusing on desire, and later on problems surrounding work and domination, Hegel appears to have shifted from theoretical questions concerning knowledge to broadly practical questions ranging from self-consciousness's power to transform the world in relation to other desiring beings, to its practical self-conceptions of its own activity as free or self-sufficient, selbstständig. So scholars who take this sort of practical self-conception approach include people like Neuhauser. I think Scott Jenkins, to an extent, takes this view, and I would put Axel Honneth also takes this view. Alan Wood takes, you could say that Alan Wood sort of has the strongest position here, where he really thinks that this idea of self-consciousness and species consciousness, he's interested in Marx, but the account is obviously connected to Hegel. He resists the idea that we should think about this in epistemological terms at all. So that's the practical self-conception view. Some other scholars have argued that Hegel's account of self-consciousness as desire is continuous with broadly theoretical questions concerning the nature of apperception, which are themselves relevant for understanding Hegel's more explicit practical reflections concerning sociality and freedom. Pippin and Pinkert are, I think, obviously in this camp. I think McDowell's heterodox reading can be put in this camp as well, emphasizing the importance of the apperception of understanding the account of self-consciousness in connection with apperception. So I think whereas the former views, so the views that emphasize these ideas of practical self-conceptions, I think these former views do not allow us to bring into focus the important epistemological dimensions of Hegel's account of self-consciousness as species consciousness. The latter's focus on apperception makes it difficult to appreciate the full significance of these dimensions, makes it difficult to appreciate the full significance of the self-relation that is expressed in being a Gattung for itself. So in order to account for these dimensions of species consciousness, I will argue that the knowing of itself, das Wissen von sich selbst, at stake here is encompassing and fundamental, preceding a distinction between theoretical and practical forms of knowing, and gives shape to both. So I think we can find evidence for this in paragraph 166, which opens chapter 4, where Hegel introduces self-consciousness not only by recapitulating consciousness's relations to objects found in the first 3 chapters, but by returning to the general account of knowing that he presented in the introduction, the passage that I just read, an account that he associated there with the method of the text as a whole. So next slide. Echoing his discussion from paragraphs 82 to 86, Hegel recounts the process of consciousness's relation to an object treated as something independent and in itself, and as something for consciousness, now making explicit that this ambiguity is both resolved and continually reproduced as self-consciousness. Finally, placing the I at the heart of the relation of knowing, Hegel writes, "The I is the content of the relation and the relating itself. It is in confronting another that the I is itself." Self-consciousness is the content of the relation of knowing, not because it is the sole source of the unity of the object of experience, as it is for Kant, but because it simply is the relation to an object that enables the object to be an object of knowledge. Likewise, the relation to an object produces the activity of self-consciousness, and the most general form of that activity is self-consciousness as desire. So moving forward, I will suggest that the characterization of self-consciousness as desire is incomplete, but this is not because self-consciousness has yet to moving from being subject to its desires to being the subject of its desires. Although I think this is a helpful distinction to make, and this is the distinction that Pippin makes. It is also not because we cannot yet make out a distinction between, say, merely animal desires and desires that are rationally shaped. Rather, as the content of the relation of knowing, self-consciousness as desire is far too indeterminate, both with respect to understanding the activity and self-relation of self-consciousness, and with respect to understanding the self-sufficient nature of the object that in turn shapes desire. For desire to be meaningful as the content of the relation of knowing, Hegel argues that it must be understood as desire that is shaped by the processes of life, and more importantly, by the form and the process of the genus or the Gattung. That self-consciousness as desire, next slide please, is always shaped by the form and processes of the genus, invites a reconsideration of the famous line that self-consciousness is Begierde überhaupt. Translators, English translators and scholars have suggested that überhaupt in this context can be read as desire in general, or as an underlining word in which it would be desire full stop. If self-consciousness is desire in general, then this generality is something that remains to be specified. And in the paragraphs that follow, Hegel will specify this generality as the generality of the genus. So what I'm saying here is that the generality of this idea of desire is connected with the generality of the idea of the Gattung, which Hegel's going to go on to develop. If self-consciousness is desire full stop, this means that self-consciousness is never not desire, but the full stop cannot mean that self-consciousness does not develop, change, or that desire does not require further determination or specification. As chapter 4 continues, Hegel aims to show that self-consciousness as desire is ultimately species consciousness, the Gattung for itself, where the activity of coming to know its own self-sufficiency and the self-sufficiency of its objects requires a grasp of life as genus. Okay, so the next slide. So now section 2, it's called the self-sufficiency of life and the simple genus. I'm going to try to think about what the idea of the simple genus or the einfache Gattung might mean, and we're going to move forward very slowly in chapter 4 to the strange passages on life. So we now have a set of terms that form a tight, mutually defining circle where each term implies all the others: self-consciousness, the I, desire, and the genus for itself. In the first section, I discussed the relation between self-consciousness, the I, and desire, showing how Hegel understands these to constitute the activity of the relation of knowing, where self-consciousness is the content of the relation of the knowing, content of that relation, and the activity of relating itself. I now want to turn to the question of how life and the genus fit into the story, completing the circle of terms that define self-consciousness for Hegel. Okay. Next slide. So one peculiar feature of Hegel's concept of self-consciousness, sorry, I lost my spot here. One peculiar feature of Hegel's account of self-consciousness is that for him, self-consciousness cannot arise and is not possible simply in relation to any object. I think this is a very strange feature of his account of desire, of self-consciousness, that for him, self-consciousness can only arise in relation to specific kinds of objects. So far from being indifferent to the shape and kind of object it faces, self-consciousness is ignited. It establishes the relation to self and relation to object proper to self-consciousness only when it faces a living object, or das Lebendige. So this passage is not from the Phenomenology. This is a passage from the third part of the Encyclopedia, where Hegel is talking about the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness, and he says that once consciousness faces the appearance of the living thing, or das Lebendige, this is how self-consciousness is ignited, and it has to do with the way in which the living thing represents, he says, an existing interior that is for itself, In the living thing, the object turns into the subjective. Consciousness discovers its own self as the essential of the object. I won't read the whole passage, but this is, I think, a very helpful passage for thinking about when Hegel says that self-consciousness is ignited only when it faces a living object. So what's so special about the living object? The three previous objects faced by consciousness, so the immediateness of sense certainty, the concrete thing of many properties of perception, and the play of forces of the understanding, these turned out to be inadequate, both in themselves as concepts of objects. Turned out they were internally incoherent, or that they presupposed something external to their own concept, but they were also inadequate in relation to consciousness. Although knowing consists of a relation of being for a consciousness, next slide, non-living objects do not exhibit adequate self-sufficiency or Selbstständigkeit in the relation of knowing, and thereby entirely collapse the necessary ambiguity between being something independent and in itself and something for consciousness. So the first three objects that we see in the phenomenology, these were, we could say, they were all unable to, quote unquote, stand up to consciousness, right? They're not self-sufficient. They're not sufficiently selbstständig. So these three objects are unable to stand up to consciousness, so to speak, with Hegel arguing that they all ultimately reduce to only being for consciousness with no self-sufficient unity or essential form of their own. So even though chapters 1 to 3 attempt to show that all consciousness of objects presupposes self-consciousness, it turns out that self-consciousness itself becomes possible in relation to an object only when that object displays adequate self-sufficiency. Only then is it, properly speaking, an object rather than mere illusion or appearance. Hegel uses the words Täuschung and Erscheinung. Objective knowing requires that something other than self-consciousness has self-sufficient being and form. And it is only in relation to such objects that self-consciousness's own self-relating activity can be realized as self-sufficient. So I think we can note here a really crucial difference between Hegel's account of self-consciousness and Kant's account of apperception. Whereas Kantian apperception is the sole source of the unity of the object, Hegel's argument is that self-consciousness is only possible on account of there being self-sufficient objects independent of self-consciousness. Moreover, these objects are not only other self-conscious subjects, although of course these objects are going to be really important, but living things as such, which display their own objective unity and form. So the importance of the object's self-sufficiency in relation to self-consciousness becomes clear in the beginning of the paragraph 168, where Hegel presents desire in relation to a living object. He begins by describing the parallels between the structure of self-consciousness as desire and the structure of the living object. Both are reflected into themselves and self-differentiated unities. Hegel writes that the object is, quote, just as self-sufficient as self-consciousness, but this is something that self-consciousness tries to deny, and that self-consciousness must learn through experience. So next slide. The self-sufficiency and processes of life, which result in the universal unity of the simple genus, the einfache Gattung, appear to play two roles here. So the first is phenomenological. Hegel is suggesting that our relation to living objects enables and ignites a particular kind of self-relation that would not be possible solely in relation to non-living objects. The phenomenological dimension of desire's encounter with life is somewhat obscure, but Hegel is clearly drawing on Schelling's claim that in order to intuit myself as active in relation to the succession of presentations that make up experience and hence be self-conscious, I must actually intuit that inner principle of activity in an external object, which is then reflected back upon the self. Living objects are the only objects that exhibit a, quote, inner principle of activity, or in Kant's terms, the self-organization of inner purposiveness. And so the intuition or affection of the activity of the living organism is a condition for intuiting myself as active and self-conscious, as an active and self-conscious mode of intelligence. This idea is very suggestive and difficult, and although it is not my claim to defend it here, I think it has the advantage of being a radically anti-solipsistic account of self-consciousness and clearly tracks Hegel's own argument concerning the importance of the self-sufficiency of the object. For Hegel, the processes of life are the basis of self-consciousness's grasp of its own activity. The nature of this activity is not only desirous and purposive, but crucially, it is a mode of activity that is, quote, the positing of individuality, das Setzen der Individualität, that takes place insofar as living beings participate in the universal processes of life. I think it's significant here that Hegel locates this important Fichtean idea of the self-positing of individuality within his discussion of the processes of life. The positing of oneself as an individual and ultimately as an I is a fundamental activity of living beings who exhibit the universality of their Gattung. In the famously obscure paragraphs describing these processes, Hegel is attempting to present the immediate, primitive shape of this activity as it appears in life as such, the encounter with which ignites self-consciousness's relation to itself. Okay, next slide. Hegel's account of life's self-sufficiency plays a second conceptual role. Life is not only a mirroring of the activity of self-consciousness, but it is a condition and logical structure of all possible intelligibility. Life for Hegel is both the immediate concept or Begriff and the immediate idea or Idee. As the immediate concept, life represents the underlying structure of all intelligible things, exhibiting a relation between individuality, particularity, and universality through its self-organized shape and activity. As the immediate idea, life represents the fundamental unity and relation between concept and object, or sometimes concept and reality, that is expressed in all truth. In the science of logic, Hegel argues that life exhibits the immediate form of judgment, and the immediate processes of life activity can themselves be understood as primitive acts of judgment. I think the logical significance of life is essential for understanding self-consciousness as an activity of knowing, and what it means for self-consciousness to be both the content of the relation of knowing and the activity of the relation itself. I think this point is, so it's definitely something that Hegel develops and argues for more clearly in the logic than in the phenomenology. But I do think that it is the logical significance of life that renders knowing contentful, with life expressing the immediate shape of the activity of knowing. Part of the difficulty of reading these paragraphs on life in the phenomenology consists in the ambiguity between these phenomenological and logical levels. I think in reading these sections, Hegel is doing work at both levels, so at both the phenomenological and the logical levels, but he doesn't really distinguish them. And arguably, a case could be made that he hasn't even fully, even himself, worked through the logical significance of the concept of life, which will come later in the science of logic. Okay, so this brings us finally to this idea. I'm going to turn now to the idea of the genus or the Gattung. So next slide, please. In paragraph 171, having discussed the processes through which life takes shape as both self-sufficiency and dynamic process, Hegel concludes that the entire cycle and processes of life can be understood as a developing, simple, self-sustaining whole. Within this process, however, a new sense of universal or reflected unity has emerged, and this is the, quote, simple genus or die einfache Gattung. The unity of the genus is contrasted with the sense of immediate unity that Hegel associates with being, which suggests that the reflected unity expressed by the genus can be associated with the positing of an essence, or is minimally a unity that presupposes some distinction between being and essence. As a reflected essential unity, Hegel also says that the genus is universal. To understand the nature of this essential reflected universality of the genus, it is helpful to turn to Hegel's discussion of universality in the logic. The first thing that the logic helps to clarify is why Hegel refers to the genus as the simple genus. So in the logic he writes, and this is the next slide, He says, universality seems incapable of explanation because it is the simplest of determinations. Explanation must rely on determinations and differentiations and must apply predicates to its subject matter, and this would alter rather than explain the simple. But it is precisely the nature of the universal to be a simple that by virtue of absolute negativity contains difference and determinateness in itself in the highest degree. Being is simple as an immediate. For this reason, we can only intend it without being able to say what it is. The concept of being is just this, that it is so simple as to vanish into its opposite immediacy it is becoming. The universal is, on the contrary, a simple that is at the same time all the richer itself, for it is the concept. So this is obviously a difficult passage, but the simplicity of the genus is not the simplicity of being, but the simplicity of the concept. It is a universality that contains within itself simple self-reference and absolute mediation. Next slide. In referring to the universality of the genus as simple, Hegel is suggesting that we cannot explain it by breaking it down into further determinations or parts. It cannot be further reduced, for it is already a one, an essential or original unity. The genus is the determinate, immanent character of universality as such, and hence simple insofar as it cannot be further broken down, but exhibits itself as universal. Next slide. So before I turn to the crucial passage that I showed in the beginning but didn't read, I will read it when I get to it this time. So before I turn to that crucial passage where Hegel discusses self-consciousness as the Gattung for itself, there's a potential objection that I want to head off here. So the worry is that the character of the genus, or the Gattung, ultimately remains limited for Hegel. Its universality is merely relative, since it is subject to endless empirical contingencies and indeterminacies that inevitably exist between all genera and lower species. This is a concern that Hegel expresses repeatedly concerning the weak universality of nature. And so the simple genus, as discussed here, cannot possibly express the universality of the concept. So there are two things I want to say in responding to this worry. First, the first most general point is that Hegel's claim of simplicity is important. If we accept that the universality here is simple, namely that it cannot be broken down or further reduced into parts, and is not simply a summation of contingent parts or an abstraction from those parts, then the universality of the genus is an irreducible shape that maintains itself despite empirical contingency. So that's the first point. Next slide. Second, and in order to acknowledge both sides, contingency and simplicity, Hegel distinguishes between the determinacy of universality as outwardly directed on the one hand, and one where its outward directedness is inwardly redirected on the other. Although that is a Hegelian mouthful, I think the point is relatively straightforward. So we can make this point, I think, in a pretty straightforward way. As outwardly directed and from an external perspective, so when we think about the genus, the universality of the genus in relation to, in its porous boundaries with other genera and species, in relation to the observations of the scientist or rational observer, trying to understand and categorize nature, the universality of the genus in these contexts is indeed relative and empirically contingent. But taken as an active, self-directed process in which its outward relations are reflected into itself, so we could say from the inside, where the processes of the genus constitute a self-reproducing whole, the universality of the genus is not contingent, but necessary for itself. Hegel writes of this inwardly redirected universality that it is, quote, higher and concrete, associating it not merely with the empirical taxonomic divisions of nature, but with, quote, life, the I, spirit, and absolute concept. So the universality of the simple genus is a concrete, self-sustaining shape that has the power to stand up to contingency to a sufficient degree so as to constitute a simple self-reproducing whole. Okay, next slide. So finally, with all of that in mind, I'm now going to think about this next slide after that. This key passage where Hegel actually says that self-consciousness is the Gattung for itself, which is a result of this claim about the einfache Gattung. Okay, so I'm going to read this passage. It is the simple genus, the einfache Gattung, in which the movement of life does not exist for itself as this simple. Rather, in this result, life points towards something other than itself, namely towards consciousness, for which life is as this unity or as genus. But this other life, dies andere Leben, for which the genus as such is, and which is the genus for itself, für sich selbst Gattung ist, namely self-consciousness, initially is to itself only as this simple essence, and to itself is an object as the pure I. Okay, so we can try to, I'm now going to try to reconstruct Hegel's account here in 5 steps. Next slide. So first, although the processes of life result in the simple self-reproducing unity of the genus, these processes do not themselves grasp the simplicity of this unity. Second, insofar as living processes exhibit the simple unity of the genus and is grasped as such, this points towards a consciousness for whom the unity of the genus exists as simple genus. This brings us back to the relation of knowing between consciousness and its object, between desire and life, which was the starting point of Hegel's discussion. Third, Hegel now identifies consciousness with as, quote, this other life, making explicit something that was perhaps obvious, namely that the desire in question is itself a form of living activity structurally identical to the simple unity it now grasps in its object. Next slide. Fourth, the living consciousness that grasps life as genus is the genus for itself. So this living consciousness that grasps life as the simple genus is the Gattung for itself, for it not only grasps the Gattung character of its objects, but its own Gattung character. It does not do so immediately, say through an act of intellectual intuition, but in a desirous relation to a living object reflected back into itself. Fifth, and finally, in grasping its own Gattung character, it is self-consciousness. It can take itself as its own object, relate to itself as simple essence, and posit itself as the pure I. Okay, so I'm now going to, next slide, please. This is a conclusion, sort of a very brief conclusion, trying to draw out some of the consequences and problems of these claims. So self-consciousness as the pure I is a desirous living activity that posits itself as the pure I insofar as it grasps the simple genus of life, and hence is the genus for itself. I want to conclude by very briefly drawing out some consequences and problems, which hopefully we can discuss in the Q&A, but also hopefully continue to work on this in future work. Okay, so next slide, please. So first, although Hegel's argument is quite complex and involves many moving parts, the relation between the I and its universal genus follows from Hegel's general claim concerning the necessary relation between any individual thing and its Gattung concept. For Hegel, any individual, or Einzelne, can be determined as an individual only in relation to a universal modeled on the unity of the Gattung. And self-consciousness and the self-conscious I is no exception. So we know this right from the very first chapter of the Phenomenology on sense certainty, that we cannot write, there is no pure this. Individuals are always grasped in relation to universals. And I think Hegel is here applying this very general principle, this logical principle that he applies everywhere, to his conception of self-consciousness or the pure I. The difference between the I and other individual things is not simply its self-positing character, since as we saw, he described the positing of individuality already in the processes of life as such, but the difference lies in its grasp of itself, both as individual and as universal at once. So that, I think, is the key difference between the I and other individual things. The I is going to be able to grasp itself as both individual and universal at once. For Hegel, then, being a self-conscious I and grasping my own Gattung character necessarily entail one another, and the self-relation is expressed in life that knows itself as life. So secondly, if self-consciousness is species consciousness, what then is the species concept that expresses the concrete universality of the I? Does it have to be something like Homo sapiens? Is it a more open, non-taxonomic conception of human beings that is closer to the historically developing activity that Hegel calls Geist? Is it simply self-consciousness as a species concept? How determinate does species consciousness have to be for the I in order for it to be self-conscious? These are all important questions that I won't be able to fully answer here, but here's the direction of an answer. Although Hegel is, I think, clearly not suggesting that we need to grasp ourselves as Homo sapiens in order to be self-conscious, the simple genus in question also cannot just be self-consciousness. The reason for this, I think, is the discussion of life, which lay out the general conditions for the possibility of self-consciousness. If the Gattung concept was just self-consciousness, then this renders the entire discussion of desire in life superfluous. The Gattung concept in question has to track the simple unity of the Gattung exhibited in all life. While it would be wrong to reduce this to a purely biological concept of a species, it would be equally wrong in Hegel's account for this universality to be completely divorced from the considerations of living things and their individual and social reproduction, through which it maintains itself as a self-sustaining, self-sufficient, simple whole. Third, and finally, in a recent book on animal life and the emergence of mind, Peter Godfrey Smith has argued that we can think of consciousness across life as something that comes in degrees. There, he rejects the light switch metaphor for thinking of consciousness as either on or off. If consciousness and self-consciousness are related in the ways that Hegel suggests, then self-consciousness is also something that can come in degrees. These degrees are not simple matters of fact, but, as Pippin has suggested, questions of practical and ultimately historical achievement. Self-consciousness as species consciousness, however, alters how we think about self-consciousness as a kind of achievement. The achievement of self-consciousness depends in part on grasping and developing the Gattung concept that it takes itself to be. Although Hegel does come to call that Gattung Geist, my suggestion is that it is both theoretically and practically important that Geist remains fundamentally a living species among other living species. Thank you.
So, thank you, Karin, for your presentation, your wonderful talk. Does somebody want to start? I can also start if nobody has a question.
Ja. Können Sie hören?
Ja.
Entschuldigung, dass ich auf Deutsch spreche, aber ja, ich weiß es nicht, ob ich eine wirklich Frage habe. Ja, ich kann sagen, zum Beispiel, es ist diese Kapitel der Phänomenologie ist zu schwierig. Der Umfang dieses Kapitels ist sehr schwierig. Ja? Alle diese Beschreibung des Lebens, ja, die Verhältnis mit Schelling auch. Ja. Und dann, was Hegel will sagen, ja. Was ist Begierde eigentlich, ja. Und so, ich habe vielleicht es ist nicht so direkt, aber Hegel ist heute zu viel kritisiert, ja. Vielleicht wegen der zum Beispiel diese Logisierung der Realität, wie kann ich sagen, ja, oder und manchmal die Kritiker sagen, dass Hegel habe eine besondere und schlechte Auffassung von Gattung, ja. Denkst du, dass die Leute heute nicht verstehen, was Hegel meint, wenn er über Gattung spricht? Du hast gesagt, über historische Perspektiven, um Gattung zu verstehen, ja, nicht nur Gattung als eine biologische Begriff, ja. Ja, vielleicht in dieser Richtung, ich frage, ja, verstehst du?
Ja, vielen Dank. So you started by saying how difficult it is, and I don't think we understand what Hegel. I have not found. I mean, this is a good thing because it means that we have more work to do. But I don't think we have a good sense of what Hegel means by Gattung. So there is the historical problem that the way that we use the terms, the way our taxonomic divisions are, of course, were not used in the same way in Hegel's time. Another there are translation issues. There's also there's the way. So I mentioned these other thinkers in the beginning that Fichte uses the term Gattung in a certain way, and then Marx uses the term Gattung. And so I think the short answer is no. I don't think we properly understand what he means by this. But I think that's a good thing because it means that we have more work to do to think about this. One thing I want to say, so it's not just I don't want to reduce it to a bio. Actually, let me say two things. The first is just that Gattung and art, so genus and species, are obviously relative terms. And so Hegel chooses to use the word Gattung in this context, but I do think that it is more, it's connected to the way that Marx thinks about species being. And so species consciousness is, I think, or I would say Marx understood Hegel rightly here. And the problem that Hegel is trying to work through is something like species consciousness. I think the way that the passage that we look at a lot more, rather than calling this the Gattung for itself, is the passage where Hegel says the I and the we, right? The I that is we and the we that is I. That's clearly a much more straightforward and another way, and another place in which he tries to bring out this idea that self-consciousness requires the consciousness of something more universal. And in that more famous passage, he just calls it the we. He doesn't say it's a Gattung. But I think if we want to sort of take seriously, right, the concept of life and the passages that lead up to the idea of self-consciousness, then I think the idea of the we is not quite enough, and that we do need to think about the meaning of the term Gattung. One of the things that I didn't say this in the talk, but there's several ways we can think about it. Well, actually, the way that I did think about it in the talk is the Gattung for Hegel is his model for thinking about the idea of simple universality. We often talk about, Hegel has this idea, he's very opposed to abstract universals, he's in favor of concrete universals. Well, what does that mean? And I think one of the ways to explain this is that for Hegel, the model for a true or concrete or simple universality, as he calls it, is basically something like a living Gattung. And this is, while it's not understood in, I'll just say taxonomical terms, it is connected for Hegel with how we understand and identify living things. So that is sort of the first significance. The Gattung for Hegel is the model for thinking about the universality, and as he said in that passage, ultimately the universality of the concept. So that's one way of thinking about the philosophical significance of the Gattung and why we can't reduce it to just a biological concept of the species. There's another aspect of this, which I didn't discuss in the paper, which is that, so in that moment in chapter 4, it almost seems like, okay, it just happens. We grasp the pure self-consciousness, grasp this idea of a simple genus, and we become self-conscious, and right, the book goes on. One of the things that is also peculiar is, of course, for Hegel, and I tried to suggest this at the end, the idea of the Gattung in the case of self-consciousness is also something that is continually developing, and it's something self-constituted, is something that develops, is something that historically changes. So even though there is this conceptual side where there is something about the Gattung that provides us with a model for universality, it's very important for Hegel that this universality is not fixed. It's precisely not an eternal essence, right? If we think ahead to problems with Marx's notion of Gattungswesen, it's for Hegel, whatever it means for self-consciousness to be the Gattung for itself also means that it's not that self-consciousness has some sort of fixed, unchanging essence. Being a Gattung for itself means that we actually have the capacity to transform and determine and constitute what it is for us to be a self-conscious Gattung. And so that's the element that I didn't talk about that much in the paper. But I do think that that's important. It's not that we grasp this simple, there is this idea, this conceptual point about the simple universality of the Gattung, but it's clearly important for Hegel that a self-conscious relationship to a Gattung means that it's something that we can shape and transform and develop.
Yeah, I have only one commentary. Yes. Have you ever read the Jenenser Systementwurf? Yeah. Jena's logic.
Oh, yeah.
And what Hegel says about Gattung, in the, maybe can help to understand what is Gattung in the phenomenology of spirit. It's very, like you say, it's very difficult to understand what Hegel means here. Yeah, when he talks about Gattung and life and yeah.
I will definitely look at those texts again, but you're right, with an eye to seeing what he says about the Gattung there. Thank you.
Thank you. Emmanuel?
Yes. So I also have a question. I don't know if if I will. If I can formulate my question clearly, I hope so. When you were talking about, so in your conclusion about, so the first point, individuality and universality, and then the second point was the concept of species, and then you mentioned spirit, and then I was thinking in that moment about as we know in Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history, there is this schema. First we have just one individual is free. And then second, some individuals are free. And then at the third moment, all individuals are free. And then the point is the human beings as human beings are free. And then I was thinking if if we can think that if we can consider self-consciousness as a consciousness of species, as something historical that we can have only modernity, or I don't know if we can have some historical naturalist conception. I don't know how we can. I don't know if it is a good question. I was just thinking at that moment on Hegel's lectures of philosophy of history, that this point about the human being as human beings as free. So we have some kind of consciousness of species, but in a historical approach.
Thank you for that. This is actually, I think, a very helpful, the way that Hegel thinks about consciousness of freedom in the philosophy of history, I think, is a helpful way of thinking about species consciousness. I like what you, so I don't think that the naturalist reading and the historical reading need to be opposed to one another per se. I would like to hope that they're not. Again, not to look ahead too much to Marx, but it certainly seems like for Marx, these two things are not opposed for him, right? Naturalism and a certain kind of historicism. But one thing that you said that I think is right and is difficult to think about is whether or not something like the kind of universal consciousness, universal species consciousness, arguably Hegel, in Hegel's own time, Hegel didn't really get it either, arguably, but is only, as you said, something possible in quote unquote modernity. I think there is something, so the idea that it's historically developing, the idea that this universality of the Gattung is something that becomes more fully universal as humanity progresses or develops, or as history moves forward, I think is a view that it is a position that follows from a lot of what Hegel says. It's certainly the case. Again, I don't want to lean too heavily on Marx since my paper was really about Hegel, but I think Marx is the one who develops this more explicitly. He clearly thinks that there's something about the conditions of, right, we even call it global capitalism, that make it such that a genuinely universal form of self-consciousness is possible in ways that arguably earlier in history, that a truly universal form of self-consciousness was not possible. I think there's a case to be made for this, maybe in Kant as well, in the way that he thinks about universal history. So this is so that all of this is just to say that I agree with you that this claim in the philosophy of history about one sum all is relevant here. What it emphasizes is the more historical dimension of something like species consciousness that I think is very important in Hegel. And then I guess maybe the next step, not an answer, but the next question is how this more historical way of understanding species consciousness is something that emerges and develops and is maybe arguably made possible with the emergence of certain things that happen in modernity. How does that square with, right, going back to the phenomenology, going back to the relation between self-consciousness and life, and how the idea of a Gattung first emerges, not as this historically developing concept, but in our relation in our encounter, in desire's encounter with another living object. I think the question of how those two aspects of Gattung and universality are connected that's a very difficult question.
Can I?
Thank you. Yes, so go ahead, Hernand.
Thank you. Karen, thank you for your presentation, very instructive. I don't have any question about your presentation, but maybe I have one other or two questions about your book, okay? Hegel's Concept of Life. So the first one, I would say, is a more historical question. In chapter 3 of your book, you contest the view proposed by Dieter Henrich that Hegel's assimilation of the concept of life was left out. I would say. Your point, if I understood correctly, is to show that there is a closer relationship with Schelling than is commonly believed. So that is, the ideas present in the different Schrift are deepened in the phenomenology of spirit and science of the logic. You argue that Hegel would agree with Schelling's idea that the organic nature provides a proof of a transcendental idealism. So my question is, if things are like that, how do you understand the main difference between Hegel and Schelling?
So I think there are a lot of differences between Hegel and Schelling. So what I was trying to suggest in the book was just that. So I mean, you actually you restated it very nicely. I tried to show that this early, the Differenzschrift is much more obviously influenced by Schelling for obvious reasons, not only because it was written during the period in which they were co-editing the journal, but also it was very close to the period where Schelling himself was working on these ideas, which he would eventually move away from. So my claim there was, I think it was both historical and conceptual. So I think Schelling is much more important, but I tried to say that, okay, what Hegel develops here in the Differenzschrift in the Schellingian language is developed in his own language and in his own way through the phenomenology and the logic. That doesn't mean that Hegel and Schelling completely converge on every issue. I mean, one thing I would just say is that I think as Schelling's own work develops in many in a very different direction, and he abandons identity philosophy. This whole idea of the whole attempt in that period to develop something like an identity philosophy gets abandoned. One way of putting it would be that Hegel doesn't abandon that project, right? Hegel continues to work on it and develops it in his own way, in a way that obviously that eventually Schelling will be very critical of. So I think there are a lot of differences. All I wanted to, the similarity that I wanted to hang on to, it was about the, in the context of the book, about the conceptual or logical significance of life that is present in these earlier, in this earlier phase of Schelling's writings. And that Hegel, I think the way that I say it is that Hegel sort of carries it through. So that's all I mean. And I do think, one thing I would say, I do think that it's difficult to understand what life, the place of life in Hegel's logic, without understanding some of that earlier Schellingian context. And also more, something I also argue in the book, that really both of them are also trying to understand things that are going on in Kant's third critique. So for me, that was the only way we could really make sense of life showing up where and when it does in the science of logic. And this very idea that there is something like a logical significance to life, that life isn't just, right? Because of course, life also, you could say that, right, the concept of the organism is, okay, that plays a role in the philosophy of nature. Not that that's easy, I think that's very difficult too, but maybe it's more obvious why we might care about organism and organic self-organization in the context of the philosophy of nature. But to understand why life has a logical significance, I sort of tried to tell the story by at least bringing early Schelling back into the picture as significant and not just, something to be gotten over or dismissed. And I do say it's not just, so the way that Henrik develops it is more, it's, his view is bigger, right? It's about, well, actually this idea that life and self-consciousness are connected, that's a very old idea. We get this idea already, right? Maybe in Aristotle and the ancients. And actually it's a move of modernity to move away from this thought. And I think, right, there's lots of interesting things to say about Hegel and Aristotle and how he's trying to maybe go back to some earlier ideas in order to develop this thought. The tendency to reject Schelling was also present in some other literature and scholarship that I mentioned, right? So there was, I think in Pippin's early book, he says that it's a Schelling problem. It's like this problem that we have to get over. There's these Schellingian sounding things. How do we make them, how do we show that they're not that important? Because obviously the Schellingian sounding things are crazy.
Thank you.
Karin, if you have more time, we have one question for that somebody put on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Can I? It's Alex Schubert. First of all, he says, thank you for the speech. It was very profound analysis of Hegel concepts of self-consciousness. However, I'm struggling with the expression of species consciousness. And then it is without doubt that self-consciousness is a social concept, a function of social interaction, but isn't species being, Gattungswesen, something that is being constituted unconsciously? So is an unconscious problem?
I wouldn't say, so what's important about the question, I wouldn't say it's being constituted unconsciously, but I would say that especially when we focus on the phenomenological side, so I said there was a phenomenological and a kind of conceptual logical side. If we put aside the conceptual logical side and just focus on the phenomenological story that Hegel's trying to tell in how we, right, self-consciousness becomes aware of itself as a species, I wouldn't say it's unconscious, but I would say that there is difficult in Hegel. It's something immediate. There's an immediacy involved in the way that right, it's sort of this immediate encounter. And, this is connected to the Schelling piece too, because I think it is also everything associated with the concept of life for Schelling in this period, and then Hegel adopts, is immediate. In the talk, I didn't say much about the problem of so I would say it's not being constituted unconsciously, but there's a certain immediacy to the way in which self-consciousness is being constituted. In the talk, I didn't say much about immediacy. I instead tried to focus on this idea of simplicity to try to capture maybe a different element, right? It's not the same as immediacy, but the way that Hegel says it's the simple universal, or this einfache Gattung, is connected with the problem of immediacy, because he's precisely saying this is something that just presents itself as an irreducible unity. And so there's something immediate about that. It's not something that we arrive at through complex inferential processes, but actually something that strikes you, at least at the phenomenological level. I think he is suggesting that even this language that he uses in the encyclopedia, he says self-consciousness is ignited. That sounds very immediate. So that I hope, so I don't know if that completely closes the gap between self-consciousness as a social, and as you said, Emmanuel, as also a historical concept, and the immediate way in which Hegel is describing this in chapter 4. One thing that I maybe could do, or one thing we could do, is separate out levels of discussion, I guess, to maybe make it more clear. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I do think that we do need to separate when Hegel is talking about the social and historical dimensions of how self-consciousness becomes increasingly aware of itself as something universal. So that sense of species consciousness, and what's being talked about in chapter 4, which is not only more immediate, but I think more at the level of I hate to use this word because Hegelians always get upset when I say more at the level of thinking about the transcendental condition, the necessary conditions for the possibility of self-consciousness. And so that was when, so I did say in the paper, that's why I didn't want to just fully agree with the people who read the section, the transition to chapter 4, along the lines of, okay, Hegel is now changing the subject. Hegel is now only interested in practical self-conceptions, which is much more amenable to this more social historical story that is obviously an important part of the phenomenology of how self-consciousness develops into Geist. I want to say, I do want to hang on to some of the more, we could say, conceptual epistemological questions of the conditions of possibility for self-consciousness. And I think at that level, Hegel is suggesting not that self-consciousness as species consciousness is something that is constituted unconsciously, but that it is something that is that there is some immediacy involved in the way in which it is constituted. Maybe another word that I didn't use, we could use a different term, maybe spontaneity. But I do think the way that I would go is to just separate out these levels, and that in those really difficult paragraphs in the transition in chapter 4, I would interpret it as Hegel thinking about the necessary conditions for the possibility of self-consciousness, which include, he is trying to argue, grasping something about the simple, the einfache Gattung, the simple universality that is exhibited in the processes of life. And that this is something that we can grasp not only in relation to ourselves, but it has to be grasped in relation to something outside the self, like an actual living object or another self-consciousness. I think that's the paradigmatic case, right? That what we're grasping about the other self-consciousness is in part its living character.
Thank you, Carrie.
Compliment. Yes. Yeah, it's very interesting because we can translate eidos from Aristotle in Latin like form or species. Yes. And when you talk about this immediacy, yes, in the phenomenology, in chapter 4,
Hegel cannot speak about ideas, only about Gattung. Yeah, maybe. He doesn't speak in the phenomenology about ideas. Or am I wrong? Yes.
No, I think you're right about that. It's sort of striking that in a way, so he uses the term, his term, right, Begriff or concept in the phenomenology. But it's not fully, we really need to get to the logic before we get a clear account of what der Begriff is, I think. He's always using it in the phenomenology, but there's no explicit account within the phenomenology itself of what der Begriff is. There is a passage in the preface where he uses the term idea in this traditional sense, idee, not in his sense, but in referring to this traditional sense, and associates it with, interestingly, there he doesn't say Gattung but art. So it's a bit messy. So I don't want to pretend like it's always very clear. But you're right. One could say that it marks a certain kind of development to try to think about eidos or form or unity or universality, to find a different way of thinking about how to articulate what universality is by means of a concept of a Gattung, as opposed to some of these more traditional terms that we might use to think about universality.
Yes, at the level of the Unmittelbarkeit, yes, you cannot speak about ideas, yes, only about Gattung. Yeah, maybe we must read the biological bibliography at the time, yes, in Germany, and Schelling on the Jenense Logik, yeah, to understand much about this very difficult section of the phenomenology, yes. Yeah. Okay, yeah. But it's very interesting, very difficult. But thank you.
Yes, Karin, thank you so much for your talk. And I don't know if somebody has some more questions. If not, we can, yes, we can end our conversation. We have almost 1 hour and a half. I also want to thank you for the people that were watching our discussion on YouTube. And
thank you so much for all your questions.
Again. Thank you again, Karin, for your time and and for the talk.
Thank you so much. The questions and comments were super helpful. So it's great.
Yeah. So then I will end the broadcast.